You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ13. Just go to Indeed.com/PODKATZ13 right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Can you afford to buy a home where you live? If you're listening in any of Canada's major urban centers and you're not already in the housing market, there's a good chance your answer is no. Housing affordability is one of the single most important issues facing Canadians today. And according to the latest polling, if you ask people under the age of 40, they'll tell you it's even more important than the economic threat posed by Donald Trump's trade war. While the baby boomers are seized with Trump and tariffs, millennials and Gen Z are more focused on what the next government will do to bring back the dream of homeownership. I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Tim Richter, CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, also part of the Canada Housing Coalition, which has launched a new campaign this week drawing attention to housing platforms in this federal election race. Hi, Tim. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, great to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, why have you chosen to launch this campaign now? Are you concerned that maybe housing policy has taken a bit of a backseat in this election with all of the global uncertainty and chaos caused by the trade war with the U.S.?
I don't know if it's taken a backseat, but we want to make sure it stays in the front seat, if that makes sense. We entered this federal election campaign with a raging housing crisis and homelessness getting worse, and we know that with the trade war, even, frankly, without a trade war and just the chaos coming from the United States and the economic impact that's going to have, that, our housing crisis will only get worse and it will only exacerbate our homelessness crisis. So we felt with our partners at the Canadian Real Estate Association, the Canadian Housing Renewal Association, and Habitat for Humanity, we felt like, we need to make sure that housing stays front and center during the federal election campaign. So we launched our campaign and a new ad about ending the housing game.
So just to remind people of where we're at with the housing shortage in this country, essentially very little progress has been made over the past 4 years, to be frank. In 2024, Canada saw a total of 245,120 new housing units, according to CMHC. That was up just 2% from the year before. And continuing on that pace for the next 5 years, Canada will see a little more than 1.2 million new units added by the end of the decade. Sounds like a lot, but the CMHC projects 3.5 million new units will be needed by 2030 to keep pace with population growth and to ensure affordability. So, Tim, a bit about how we got here. Canada's had a national housing strategy in place since the Trudeau government launched it in 2018. That's going on 7 years now that the federal government's been actively implementing this national housing strategy, but it apparently hasn't had much of an effect. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of things going on. One is this is a problem that's more than 40 years in the making. It really began in the 1980s when the federal government and provinces stopped building affordable housing, stopped incentivizing the construction of rental housing, and started, building regulations at a municipal level that just made construction so much more expensive. And so you're looking now at, you take all of that, of course, and then you obviously have population growth and economic growth in that time. And so we've got a problem 40 years in the making. The federal government stepped back into, housing leadership in after the 2015 election. And a lot of the money, to be honest, spent in the National Housing Strategy went to fix old social housing that just, was falling apart over time. And some of the stuff that was built at, a very high rent. So it's, you know, uh, to be charitable, I think in a lot of ways, the federal government, after 40-year absence, stepped back into housing, but it had been so long they kind of forgot how to do it. And the other problem is, frankly, that as we've been talking a lot in this trade war environment about a Team Canada approach, that's really what we need. So, because if the federal government is doing, on one hand, investing a lot of money in housing, but the provinces aren't doing anything, and the municipalities don't do anything or don't do enough, then you're not going to get very far. The federal government alone, no level of government is going to be able to solve this housing crisis, which is, gets back to one of the points we want to make in this campaign, that if we are going to make progress on solving the housing crisis, we need a Team Canada approach. We need the federal government and the provinces and the cities all working together.
When we hear the term affordable housing, it kind of has a few different meanings. There's a few layers to this problem. So there's social housing, which is subsidized housing, but that's not what affordable housing means. Like, the CMHC has this target, 3.5 million homes. That's not all subsidized government housing, right? So what makes a house or a home, a unit, a quote unquote affordable?
Well, this is probably one of the biggest holes in the national housing strategy. Is the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation actually has 4 or 5 different definitions of affordable, and none of those are relative to a person's income. So, a lot of their definition of affordable is relative to how expensive the market is. So 20% below market is deemed to be affordable in some context, but that's still wildly unaffordable for anybody that's on a fixed income or on income support or disability benefits. So one of the most important things that we should be doing is getting real clear on what do we mean by affordable. And in my view, affordable is geared to income. So what can a person on disability benefits, what can they afford if they're only spending 30% of their income? What can somebody who is earning minimum wage realistically afford, and ensure that affordability is geared to a person's income?
If we take a look at what's been released so far by the main federal parties in this election campaign, I can't help but notice something that I'd like to ask you about. The NDP says it will nearly triple housing starts to 3 million by 2030. The Liberal Party says it'll double the current pace of housing construction to nearly 500,000 new homes a year. That's 2.5 million by 2030. The Conservatives aren't pledging a specific number of new homes, but they say their plan will see municipalities build 15% more homes than their target, compounding each year until 2030. I'm not sure what the exact math is on that, but that's what's on offer from the federal parties so far. Not one of them is pledging to meet that full 3.5 million target for new homes. The closest is the NDP pledging 3 million, 500,000 units short. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think there's different levels of ambition in these targets. And I do think, we have to find a way to close that gap. The closest, I think, getting there is really the Liberals, who are saying they'll do 500, double production to 500,000 a year. I've seen experts like Mike Moffat debating, what we actually need. But, the fact is, none of the parties will achieve their goals if there isn't some kind of agreement with the provinces and the cities. the federal government, and this is the lesson of the last decade with the current Liberal government, is the lesson is they can't do it alone. And one of the things that we've been stressing is it's time for some kind of national housing accord, some kind of agreement like we do with healthcare and they've done with childcare and other things, where the federal government sits down with the provinces, agrees to a set of targets, agrees to targets on reducing homelessness, agrees to housing production targets, agrees to reducing development charges and fees and taxes on new housing, agrees to what the incentives are going to be and who is doing what in the system, because none of the parties can deliver their platforms alone. And Canadians are clearly expecting governments to work together.
Okay. You have a list of 10 policy recommendations, and I'd like to take a look at a few in particular.
Sure.
One is to take action to prevent renters from falling into homelessness. That's a major focus for the NDP, by the way, as well. They have pledged to implement some kind of national rent control. But aside from that, you warn of an increase to, quote, predatory market practices commonly seen in times of economic vulnerability, end quote. What are those predatory market practices?
Well, what we're really worried about is, when the economy is the way it is and there's a pressure from the United States, the Canadian dollar goes down relative to the US dollar. And there are some huge American hedge funds and investors that, would love to be able to buy large chunks of Canadian real estate at a discount, right? If the Canadian dollar is at 70 cents in the US dollar, they get a 30% discount on this housing. And I'm, we're a bit worried about, these big companies coming in and buying up, not just a house here or there, but buying up entire companies, buying up billions of dollars worth of assets from Canadian companies, and flipping those and effectively increasing rent in them, right? That's people refer to the financialization of the housing system. That's one of the things we're quite worried about. So we got to think about, can we prevent that kind of thing from happening?
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ13. Just go to Indeed.com/PODKATZ13 right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
And another thing you warn of here is large-scale purchase of housing from foreign hedge funds to protect and preserve the existing affordable rental stock. I'm curious, how much of that is going on in Canada today?
Well, there is that is a kind of a fixture in the market where people are looking to invest in housing, and so they're buying up. My son, for example, is going to university, and he and 6 buddies are living in a house that's been bought by an investor and converted into apartments. And, between them, they're paying an awful lot more than the place is worth. And, so one of the things where, that's fairly common, and that's one of the things that's causing rents to increase around the country. Interestingly, one of the other recommendations in this report is a return to something called the MERB program from the 80s, and that spurred hundreds of thousands of units of new housing before 1980, and that would actually create an alternative investment vehicle, and we think that could have the impact of diverting some of the investor interest in housing into new construction versus buying up older things and converting it and increasing the rent.
You're calling as well for a doubling of the share of what's known as non-market housing. What is that?
Yeah. Social housing. Think of it, there's different words for community housing, social housing, but it's essentially affordable housing that is where the rent is geared to a person's income.
And how do we go about doubling? Like 2 times the amount? How do we go about financing that? Who builds that kind of housing? Where does the money come from?
There's lots of different ways. There's lots of different ways to get there, and you see some ideas in the different platforms and portfolios. But ultimately, it really takes an active role of government by governments in order to do it, because this is housing that's not going to make people any money, right? It's not where the market's going to be served. The market's going to serve people. So, in Canada right now, about 3.5% of our overall housing system is social or this kind of deeply affordable housing. And the OECD average is about 6.5%, 7%. So in order for us to get to the OECD average, we need to add 655,000 units of new housing. And to put that into context, Canada, in the last 30 years has only built 500,000 units of new purpose-built rental. So it is a huge lift to achieve, for sure. But it's going to take very purposeful, very direct intervention and action by government. And the first thing that comes to people's mind is, well, how are you going to pay for all of that? There's a lot of different ways that this can be put together, and we have some ideas in this platform. You could, for example, with the previous government talked about making federal land available for housing. That takes 25% of the cost off a unit. You remove development charges. That takes, that could take another $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 a unit off of the cost. And then you use things like low-income housing tax credits or direct government grants to develop that property. There's lots of different ways to make it work, but I think it's critically important.
And you mentioned development charges there. I'd like to pick up on that because that's a factor in both non-market and market housing. It's also something that is set by the municipal government. So the Liberal Party, for example, Liberal leader Mark Carney has pledged to cut development charges in half. Great. It's not the federal government's jurisdiction. So how does the federal government achieve a reduction in development charges?
Well, that's exactly why I was saying you need to come to an agreement with the provinces and the cities. Ultimately, the provinces can control that, and the cities, the cities are using this money for different things. But as my friend Mike Moffat likes to say, if you tax housing like you tax cigarettes, you're going to get the same outcome, right? People just aren't going to build new housing because it gets too expensive. So we need to find a way to reduce the taxes, but then help municipalities, pay for the things they need to, parks and whatever else that they use the development charges for. So we got to find a way to reduce the taxes on new housing. But, again, it comes back to we need some kind of national housing accord, some kind of agreement between the federal government, the provinces and the cities, and Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership on how exactly we're going to solve this housing crisis and who's going to do what. Because the federal government can't, on its own, cut development charges unless it's going to start paying for everything those development charges are covering.
Right, making municipalities whole, because that's a vital stream of revenue for them. So that would that necessitate some kind of direct transfer, either from the federal level to the provinces or federal government direct to municipalities, something like that?
I think there has to be a negotiation. There has to be a conversation. Like when the federal government removed the GST on new purpose-built rental, there was municipalities in British Columbia and in Metro Vancouver that increased their development charges by precisely the amount of money that the GST would take off, right? To fund water treatment plants or something like that. Like there has to be an agreement on who's going to do what, and in exchange for whatever measures, the cities agree not to increase these development charges. Whether it's a transfer, whether it's tax issue, whether it's finding alternative means to fund things, whether it's just not using, not taxing at that rate, because there's some argument that some of these charges just aren't necessary, are needed. And there's governments in Ontario in particular that are sitting on billions of dollars that they've charged but not used. So, we have to look at alternative ways to solve these problems.
Yeah, I would point out that the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party have both pledged to take the GST off of new homes. For the Conservatives, up to $1.3 million, for the Liberals, up to $1 million in purchase price. But if the municipality in which those homes are being constructed on day one jacks up the development charges by the same amount, well, there's effectively going to be no change to the cost of construction.
Exactly.
Wow.
And then, of course, you run into the problem that do we have enough people to build the houses we need to build?
Well, I was going to ask you about that, right? So maybe we can close on this. All of these policy recommendations and initiatives, great. Having the right housing policy in place is key, certainly. But at the end of the day, Tim, we need people with hands to build the homes. So how is the labor force looking with respect to these housing targets?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, a couple of ways we can come at this. One is reduce the labor intensity of housing construction and get the right workforce. So on the first point, I think we really need to look at innovation. We really need to look at how do we do more factory built housing? How do we make, like, we're building homes the same way we've done for 50 years, right? Like this same basic way. The materials have changed a little bit, but I think the burning platform that's been created by what's going on in the United States it could really force us to have a look at how we build homes in this country. And if, for example, the government wants to build new social housing and wants to build new military housing, they can be the customers for these new factories building modular and factory built homes. The other part is certainly the labor issue. There's a lot of concerns that a significant part of the construction workforce is retiring. I think, there are going to be a whole lot of people in the United States who feel no longer welcome then, that are terrific tradespeople that we should, open the door and invite those folks to come and work here, but also, look at what skills we need in the new economy. What skills do we need to, build homes in a factory, or how can we reuse some factories that may not be used anymore? Could they be reused for housing? Could some of those workers be retrained? I don't know. And how do we get more people into the skilled trades? And we've certainly seen the parties talking a bit about that as well. So it's a bit of everything, but again, comes down to federal provincial agreement, because education is provincial jurisdiction. Immigration is federal jurisdiction. There's a federal building code and there are provincial building codes. Like, we have to line these things up, and you certainly can't build, factory built housing when, the code in Burnaby says your door needs to be 32 inches and your code in Port Coquitlam says it needs to be 34 inches and the code in Scarborough has to be 36. Like, unless we find a way to standardize some of these things, it's going to be really hard to scale. So again, we need to get the governments together.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you, Tim, for joining the show today and shedding some light on some of these solutions that we can hopefully expect from whatever government forms after this federal election. And hopefully we've given the listeners some good information, maybe some questions to ask about housing platforms when their local candidates come door knocking in this election season. If people want to read more about the campaign, where can they find more information?
Yeah, endthehousinggame.ca.
Endthehousinggame.ca. And again, that's the Housing Canada Coalition, which is a partnership with you at the Alliance to End Homelessness, the Canadian Real Estate Association, Habitat for Humanity, and the Canadian Housing Renewal Association, right?
You betcha.
Excellent. All right, Tim Richter, CEO, Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Thank you again for your time today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to touch you again, David.
And that is the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast players. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ13. Just go to Indeed.com/PODKATZ13 right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.